Communication, Capitalism and Critique. This is Christian Fuchs' podcast that presents critical analysis of communication and society. The podcast is hosted by the journal CCC. You can access that journal under www.triple-c.at. Welcome to this episode of the Communication, Capitalism and Critique podcast. The title of this episode is Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed and Digital Socialist Utopias. This podcast episode discusses, as the title says, digital socialist utopia in the context of a novel, Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. This novel was first published in 1974. And this episode is based on an article I have written that was published in the journal CCC. The title of this article is The Utopian Internet, Computing, Communication and Concrete Communist Utopias, reading William Morris, Peter Kropotkin, Ursula Le Guin and PM in the light of digital socialism. That article is part of a special issue titled Communicative Socialism, Digital Socialism, that was published as a special issue in the journal CCC, Communication, Capitalism and Critique, in volume 18, number 1. So you can access that as Creative Commons in the journal at www.triple-c.at. The special issue consists really of 15 excellent contributions that are all very much worth reading. So check it out, this special issue. Ursula Le Guin was an American science fiction author who lived from 1929 until 2018. Her novels and short stories are often set in a future anarcho-communist society on distant planets. The Dispossessed is one of Le Guin's most widely read novels. It describes life on two planets, Anaris and Eurus. On the first planet, Anaris, there is an anarcho-communist society. On the second planet, Eurus, there are capitalist societies. I'm particularly interested in the role of technology and communication technologies in these societies. I want to start by focusing a bit on socialist utopias in general. In the essay Utopia and Science Fiction, Raymond Williams argues that utopian fiction often features the world altered by natural events, the world altered by willed human transformations, or the world altered by technological transformations. Utopian fiction, according to Williams, makes visible aspects of paradise, whereas dystopian fiction has the same features as utopian fiction, but according to Williams, makes visible aspects of hell. In this podcast, I'm interested in utopian socialist writings. So we can first ask, what is utopia? What is utopian socialism? In the manifesto of the Communist Party, Marx and Engels speak of critical utopian socialism and communism, utopian communism, as a kind of literature and a type of political movement that emerged and developed in late 17th and early 18th century. Such literature and movements were associated with Henri de Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier in France and Robert Owen in Great Britain. Marx and Engels write that these authors' visions of socialism and the social experiments that took place back then were part of a period when feudal society was being overthrown and the first direct attempts of the proletariat to attain its own ends were undertaken but necessarily failed. They failed because, in Marx and Engels' opinions, because of the then underdeveloped state of the proletariat, that's a quote, and, quote, continued, the absence of the economic condition for the proletariat's emancipations, conditions that had yet to be produced and could be produced by the impeding bourgeois epoch alone, end of quote. So they are arguing that utopian socialism was coming too early and that the times were not yet ripe for the development of socialism. So Marx and Engels argued that these visions of socialism could not be realized at the time that when they were conceived. Marx and Engels write, I quote, "Such fantastic pictures of future society, painted at a time when the proletariat is still in a very undeveloped state and has but a fantastic conception of its own position, correspond with the first instinctive yearnings of that class for a general reconstruction of society." End of quote. This means that Marx and Engels understand utopias as fantastic visions of future societies that cannot be realized in a realistic manner under the current societal framework and can also not be realized in the near future. Marx and Engels criticize the abstract character of utopias. They write, I quote, "But these socialist and communist publications contain also a critical element, a grain of truth, so to speak. Yeah? They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class." So they did not simply dismiss utopian socialist visions, but said they were coming too early, but they have contain critical elements that anticipate socialist societies. In his work Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, published in 1880, Engels writes that utopian socialists are, I quote, "drifting off into pure fantasies." He argues that utopian socialism is moralistic and lacks a scientific analysis of capitalism and its contradictions. Engels writes, I quote, "The socialism of earlier days certainly criticized the existing capitalistic mode of production and its consequences." So he talks about utopian socialism here. "But it could not explain them and therefore could not get the mastery of them. It could only simply reject them as bad." So Engels argues here that utopian socialism was not a form of class struggle, but a form of moralism. Engels thought that Marx's approach of historical materialism and his notion of surplus value helped turning socialism into a science. So Engels writes, "These two great discoveries, the materialistic conception of history and the revelation of the secret of capitalistic production through surplus value, we owe to Marx. With these discoveries, socialism became a science. To accomplish this act of universal emancipation is the historical mission of the modern proletariat. To thoroughly comprehend the historical conditions of this, the very nature of this act, to impart to the now oppressed proletarian class a full knowledge of the conditions and of the meaning of the momentous act it is called upon to accomplish, this is the task of the theoretical expression of the proletarian movement. This is scientific socialism." End of quote. In his book, The Historical Novel, Georg Lukács argues that although classical utopian socialist literature in its, I quote, "step beyond capitalism follows fantastic path, its critical historical basis is nonetheless linked, especially in the case of Fourier, with a devastating critique of the contradictions of bourgeois society. In Fourier, despite the fantastic nature of his ideas about socialism and the ways to socialism, the picture of capitalism is shown with such overwhelming clarity in all its contradiction that the idea of the transitory nature of this society appears tangibly and plastically before us." So a bit differently from Engels, who only appreciated Marx's critique of capitalism, Lukács stresses that there is a powerful critique of capitalism in utopian socialist writings. How should we think of Engels' concept of scientific socialism today? I'm a bit skeptical about it because the 20th century showed that science and technology and their class character have played a role in the advancement of exploitation, inequality, unemployment, precarity, environmental degradation, genocide, extermination, manipulation, and so on. In addition, both social democratic reformists, led by Bernstein, and Stalinists used the notion of scientific socialism, they used and abused it, for arguing that capitalism automatically has to collapse due to its internal contradictions that behave like natural laws. So they downgraded the importance of class struggle in order to argue that capitalism necessarily, like by a natural law, has to collapse because of its internal contradiction, and that socialism by natural law follows out of the collapse of capitalism. However, the development of the 20th century has shown the problems of the assumption that science automatically creates socialism, and that socialism is a natural science or develops as part of a law of nature. Revisionism and Stalinism both tried to transfer insights from the natural sciences to the social sciences. They disregarded the differences between nature and society. They used naturalistic, deterministic, and reductionistic models of society in order to justify either pure reformism, in the case of social democratic revisionism, or state capitalist terror in the case of Stalinism. There's a kind of natural science fetishism in both revisionist social democracy and Stalinism. They both discounted and degraded the importance of class struggles. To speak of socialism as a science has really become problematic. However, the political perspective of socialism has remained highly important until today. The age of digital capitalism in 21st century society. Critical Marxist theories of technology make use of dialectical analysis in order to avoid the determinism inherent in revisionist and Stalinist theories. In the light of the rise of what could be called authoritarian capitalism today, socialism not just needs brilliant analysis of what is wrong in society that can be provided by Marxist theory, it also needs visions of 21st century socialism, and in this respect novels and literature and popular culture are of particular importance, because they can provide visions that show how society can be transformed and how it can look like in the future. Such visions can inspire contemporary class struggles. So perhaps contemporary socialist thought is sometimes too analytic. We need new inspirations for concrete utopian socialism, inspiration from stories, visions, literature, and popular culture that tell us how socialism could work today and in the near future, how communicative and digital socialism could work. Such stories can influence and inspire contemporary socialist strategies and class struggles. Utopia is a word that has its origin in the combination of two Latin words. U, the word for not, and topos, the word for place. So utopia is a non-place, the place of nowhere. On the one hand, nowhere is a place that only exists in our fantasy as dreams that might never be possible and will therefore never come true. So in one sense, utopias refer to illusions. But on the other hand, utopias are also visions of society as a better place. Such socialist visions can become reality and can not just inspire our dreams. They can also inspire our collective struggles for a better world. In the article Dystopia Now, the socialist science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson argues that the difference between utopias and dystopias is, I quote, that utopias express our social hopes, dystopias our social fears, end of quote. Robinson argues that not just utopias but also dystopias often have an ideological character. Such dystopias that are ideological tend to communicate that nothing can be changed and that they therefore advance a kind of defeatism. Robinson therefore argues for the dialectical mediation of dystopias with socialist utopias. He argues in the same article, I quote, "These days I tend to think of dystopias as being fashionable, perhaps lazy, maybe even complacent, because one pleasure of reading them is cozying into the feeling that however bad our present moment is, it's nowhere near as bad as the ones these poor characters are suffering through. Utopia is the idea that the political order could be run better. Dystopia is the not, being the idea that the political order could get worse. Anti-utopias are the anti, saying that the idea of utopia itself is wrong and bad, and that any attempt to try to make things better is sure to wind up making things worse, creating an intended or unintended totalitarian state or some other such political disaster. Then he continues to talk about Orwell and Huxley, saying, it's a continuation of the quote, 1984 and Brave New World are frequently cited examples of these positions. One way of being anti-utopian is to be utopian. An adequate life provided for all living beings is something the planet can still do. If dystopia helps to scare us into working harder on that project, which maybe it does, then fine, dystopia, but always in service to the main project, which is utopia. End of quote. So Ken Stanley Robinson argues that utopias and science fiction tell us something about the time they were written in. They are manifestations of potentials, potential futures, hopes, and structures of feeling of society's reality at a certain time. In the article The Realism of Our Time, Robinson writes, that's another quote, "When you talk about the future, you're always talking about history. A novel always does this, but science fiction does so explicitly, through thought experiments. If we do this, we'll get here. If we do that, we'll get there. Science fiction is the realism of our time." He takes up the same motive in a talk titled "Science Fiction is the Realism of Our Time" that was presented at the University of Texas at Dallas on the 26th of April 2019. In this talk, Robinson said, I quote, "Science fiction is describing the feel of our time. It's not a factual analysis of the situation. It's not trying to predict the future. It's trying to say how this moment feels and what human history means right now." These discussions about utopia and socialism also remind me of the importance of Ernst Bloch's book, The Principle of Hope, his opus magnum about hope, where in this book Bloch distinguishes, among many other things, between abstract utopias and concrete utopias. Abstract utopias outline impossible being. They remain stuck in what Bloch calls dreaminess, and they are what he calls world-blind hope. In contrast, concrete utopias outline the not yet of society. They outline a being that is possible but does not yet exist. Concrete utopias deal with what Bloch calls the real possible and what he calls the not yet becoming good. Concrete utopias give grounds for what Bloch describes as militant optimism and what he says is an active hope of class struggle. Bloch writes, "The concretely utopian is an objective real degree of reality on the front of the occurring world, as not yet being. Concrete utopia stands on the horizon of every reality. Real possibility surrounds the open dialectical tendencies and latencies to the very last." End of quote. In concrete socialist utopias, the good life in a socialist society shines forth already today. So that's what Bloch calls foreshine, the shining forth. In the better future, socialist society can also already shine forth in the here and now. We can already anticipate it in the here and now, which should not remain abstract, but should be part of our concrete practices, so that it influences very concrete class struggles against capitalism and for socialism. So Bloch writes that the concrete socialist utopia is concerned to deliver the forms and contents which have already developed in the womb of present society. Utopia, in this no longer abstract sense, is thus the same as realistic anticipation of what is good, which must have become clear. Already, so that's end of quote. Already Marx talked about concrete utopias in 1843 when he wrote a letter to Arnold Ruge in September 1843, where he wrote that concrete utopias are making the world aware of its own consciousness. They are awakening it, the world, out of its dream about itself. Concrete utopias for Marx are the, I quote, reform of consciousness not through dogmas. They make evident that the world has long dreamed of possessing something of which it has only to become conscious in order to possess it in reality. So already this idea of the concrete utopia, in distinction to the abstract illusionary utopia, was immanent in Marx. Now it's time for a musical interlude. This is the song "The Star Behind" by the band Bardo Pond. This song was published on freemusicarchive.org under a Creative Commons license. And this song, "The Stars Behind" by Bardo Pond, was performed at the All Tomorrow Parties Festival in 2010. Eduardo Pont, the stars behind. So, in the first talk of this first part of this episode, I talked a little bit about the concept of the utopia, socialist utopias, and the distinction between abstract utopias and concrete utopias. And I do think that socialist literature can help us to envision utopias of a socialist society, not in an abstract sense, but in the sense of Bloch's concrete utopias, so that they can influence our practices, our collective practices in everyday life. So I want to talk a bit about Ursula Le Guin's book, The Dispossessed. It was published first in 1974. The Dispossessed is a science fiction novel that deals with life in future societies located on two different planets. The socialist planet Anaris and the capitalist society Arlo on the planet Eurus. In his book, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, the Marxist literary theorist Frederick Jameson writes that in the 1960s and 1970s there was, I quote, a whole explosive renewal of utopian thinking and imagination, and for a rebirth and the rebirth of the older narrative form. Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed was the richest literary reinvention of the genre. End of quotes. On Eurus, this planet, societies are shaped by private property, classes, capital accumulation, money, commodity exchange, and markets. The reader of The Dispossessed learns that on this planet and its various national societies, one finds commodity fetishism, a gender division of labor, competition, tabloid journalism, exams in universities and schools, and wars. It's overall a rich but highly unequal, exploitative and war-waging planet. Visiting Eurus from Anaris, the book's main protagonist Shebek comments, it's a quote, "And you, the possessors, are possessed. You are all in jail, each alone, solitary, with a heap of what he owns." On Anaris, in contrast, we find collective worker ownership of companies and the means of production, federations of organizations, participatory democracy, gender equality, and an administration called the Production and Distribution Coordination, PDC, that does not rule over citizens but merely coordinates production. The Production and Distribution Coordination consists of volunteers who are selected by lot and serve for a period of 5 years. There are no contagious diseases on Anaris, and Anaris is a planet and a society built on mutual aid and solidarity. Its principles are that one should give and not sell, and that having is wrong and sharing is right. We learn in the book that people typically work 5 to 7 hours a day and 4 to 5.5 days a week, which totals up to between 20 hours and 38 hours and a half per week. The settlers who built society on Anaris deliberately left Eurus because they wanted to escape from capitalism. On Anaris, they built an alternative society, the Odonian society. But Anaris is a planet with low vegetation, a very rough climate, and no animals. It's a quote from the book, "Anaris is all dust and dry hills." Therefore, it's much more difficult to sustain an economy on Anaris than on the capitalist planet Eurus. The advantage of the conditions that we find on Anaris is that it's quite unlikely that imperialists from Eurus would try to ever conquer Anaris, because there is no wealth to be appropriated and exploited on the planet of Anaris. Imperialists, therefore, in the book stick to organized exploitation on their own planet. However, there's also a big disadvantage on trying to organize a socialist society on such a planet. The disadvantage is that building a socialist society under such difficult environmental conditions is extremely hard or almost impossible. And one can also see the result of that in the book. The result is that Anaris is a rather poor socialist society with very low productivity. The productive forces are not highly developed. They are in a low state of development. The planet and society there and the humans experience phases of collective hardship, of poverty, of famine, and so on. But scarcity is also a potential source of the emergence of class divisions. So Anaris faces the danger of turning back into a class society. And also, Anaris is not free of antagonisms and asymmetric power. The book discusses the case of the scientist Sabul, who uses his reputation and influence to make others work for him. He takes the credit for others' labor, a process that can be termed academic exploitation. And of course, such academic exploitation also happens, and is quite widespread actually, in contemporary bourgeois society. Now, let's listen to more music, a song published as Creative Commons by the post-rock band Broken Cities on music.brokencities.com, which is a Bandcamp page, where you can download that music and where you can also support the band. This song is called Breach by the band Broken Cities. Breach, a song by broken cities. I'm going to continue the discussion of socialist utopias and Ursula Le Guin's novel, The Dispossessed. And I want specifically next, I want to have a look at the role of technology and production in The Dispossessed. Heavy physical, unpleasant and dangerous labor exists on Anaris. However, such labor is performed on rotational duty. So there is labor such as toilet cleaning or garbage collection, and it is collectivized. Shevek explains, that's a quote, "Well, we all do them, such dirty work, yeah? But nobody has to do them for very long unless he or she likes the work. One day in each decade, that's a set of 10 days, the community management committee or the block committee or whoever needs a certain person can ask him or her to join in such work. People take the dangerous hard jobs because they take pride in doing them. They can egoize, we call it. They can show off." End of quote. In The Dispossessed, adverse economic and environmental conditions result in a 4-year-long period of famine. Individuals take on jobs wherever they are needed, which rips apart families and friendships and makes the individuals quite unhappy. There is no forced labor. Individuals could refuse accepting jobs in regions far away from their friends and family, but their sense of duty and a culture where the collective interest is seen as being much more important than the individual interest makes them not considering this option. They do not want to be seen as individualists. Quote from the book, "To survive, to make a go of life, an Anaresti knew he had to be ready to go where he was needed and do the work that needed doing." End of quote. The book shows that the socialism of scarcity is built on the principle of equality, but does not automatically make individuals and society happy. So The Dispossessed is not really a socialist utopia in respect to life on Anaris. Yeah? This socialism of scarcity that we find on Anaris renders it difficult to realize a dialectic of collective and individual interests, whereas capitalism on Euros fetishizes individualism without nourishing the collective and common good. The socialism of scarcity that we find on Anaris fetishizes collectivism without individuality. The socialism of scarcity does not give enough space to individual interests and needs. High productivity, we learned, or is the implication of the novel, is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for a socialism that enables wealth and happiness for all. The Dispossessed presents, as the subtitle of some of its editions of the book indicates, an ambiguous utopia. In the book Critical Theory and Science Fiction, Carl Friedman argues that The Dispossessed is, I quote, "a self-critique of anarchism." The book shows that, quote, "material privation not only sets quantitative limits to the achievements of socialism, it may qualitatively deform socialist values at their very core." End of quote. In contrast to the situation on Anaris, labor on Euros is highly productive and creates an overall richer society. Visiting Euros, the book's main protagonist Shevek is impressed by, the greatness of the enterprise of building spaceships on Euros. In contrast, the ships of Anaris' space fleet are 200 years old. That's a quote, "Build just a ship to carry grain across the sea. It takes a year's planning, a big effort of our economy," Shevek says. Le Guin's book faces the danger of cementing the myth that a communist society is necessarily less productive and poorer than a capitalist society. In the book Archaeologies of the Future, The Desire Called Utopia and Other Science Fictions, Frederick Jameson argues that Le Guin's novels are, quote, "the prototype of a utopian commitment to the countryside and the village, to agriculture and small face-to-face groups, as opposed to the urban celebrations of a Delany," another socialist science fiction author. "The commitment of a pastoral Morris," that's William Morris, "as opposed to the industrial William Bellamy. Indeed, the opposition probably becomes meaningful only after industrialization in the 19th and 20th centuries." End of quotes. On the one hand, there is a point to the criticism that Le Guin did not describe high-tech socialism. In the essay Ursula Le Guin, Herbert Marcuse and the Fate of Utopia in the Postmodern, Andrew Reynolds argues that, I quote, Le Guin's suggestion is that so long as suffering is freely shared like everything else, then even the most extreme hardship may be chosen and made part of one's freedom. But Le Guin writes in response to such criticism, the criticism that her novels avoid high tech. She argues that technologies such as making a fire without matches are very complex and that all science fiction is in one way or another technological. She says that in her novels, the hard stuff's inside, it is hidden. There are computers on Anaris, so it's in an anarcho-primitivist society could not survive without science and technology. And also, if there were no science and technology, then a tech communist such as Shevek would not exist on a planet such as Anaris. Le Guin does not provide answers to the question of how high-tech socialism is possible, but she inspires us to ask the right questions. Questions such as, what would have happened if the settlers had stayed on Eurus and had successfully organized a revolution there? How would a socialist society look like on Eurus? So really the utopian socialist moment and element in Le Guin's The Dispossessed is not a society as she describes it on Anaris. It is more something that we can imagine, the socialist utopia, how it would look like on a society that is as productive in respect to the productive forces as we can find it on Eurus, where however there's a capitalist society, and that on the other hand needs relations of production, socialist relations of production as we can find them on Anaris. And I do think that what is really socialist utopian in The Dispossessed is the social character of Shevek. Shevek, who is a communist character, communist social character, who believes in socialism and class struggle and equality and democracy on the one hand, and also sees the potentials of the socialist use, design, and transformation of science and technology in order to advance a post-scarcity socialism. So, such questions about what would happen if on Eurus a socialist society were created, how would a socialist society look like based on productive forces as we can find them on Eurus, what is the role of science and technology in a socialist society. Such questions are the hard stuff that is hidden inside of Ursula Le Guin's novels. In this context, Everett Hemner argues in the essay The Gap in the Wall, Partnership, Physics and Politics in the Dispossessed, that the Dispossessed is, I quote, an incomplete utopia, but we see the beginnings of revolution in Do and A Low and the hope of renewed progress in the revolution on Anaris, end of quote. When Shevek visits Eurus, his hosts try to keep him from meeting the poor. They are afraid that he could lead or inspire a revolution. The dominant class on Eurus is interested in Shevek's theory of simultaneity. This class tries to hide him from the propertyless class. The real concrete utopian socialist potential that the book outline is when Shevek joins revolutionaries in Ben Billy, an underdeveloped part of Eurus, where the propertyless rebel against the exploitation. This part of the story focuses on class struggle as the potential for the creation of a highly developed socialist society. The settlers who built socialism on Eurus fled not just from capitalism but also from class struggle. They were abstract utopians, trying to create an autonomous society under improper material conditions. And Shevek is a concrete socialist utopian who believes and wants to foster the power of computing technology for advancing socialism. On Anaris, there are computers that coordinate the administration of things. The Division of Labor Office hosts a huge database that contains information about every work that needs to be done, about the priorities of all workers and their assignments. Le Guin hints at the importance of coordinating the demand and supply of labor or of work in a socialist society via network computing. I want to next take a look at this topic of communication and culture in Ursula Le Guin's book, The Dispossessed. On Anaris, there are no national languages. People speak Pravic, that like Esperanto is a constructed artificial language. On Anaris, there is not so much need for long-distance communication via radio, telephone, or postal mail, because there is no sales communication. They don't sell commodities. Everything is given for free as a gift, a communist gift economy. There's also little sense of privacy, which is why personal letters are not sealed. One could be critical about that fact. So certainly also in a socialist society there needs to be a certain sense and a certain level of privacy. On Anaris, life is very local. Personal telephone calls are rare and have to be arranged in advance. The PDC controls which letters are sent to Eurus or rejected, because the letter's inhabitants are seen as enemies. This means that there's also censorship of such communication that goes to the other planet. Šebek is a real and concrete socialist. He created his theory of time because it can underpin the creation of an instantaneous interstellar communication system, so to speak, of an internet of the universe. This internet of the universe, which is my own term for it, is called the Ansible, which is short for the answerable. The Ansible is, I quote from the book, a device which will permit communication without any time interval between 2 points in space. So we will be able to use it to talk between worlds without the long waiting for the message to go and the reply to return. It's like a kind of telephone. End of quote. Like Tim Berners-Lee, who made the World Wide Web, comments, also Šebek in The Dispossessed does not want to earn money from his theory and the resulting communication system, the Internet of the Universe. He wants to give his ideas to the world as a gift. Šebek explains his motivation. I'd like to share it out. It ought to be given out. Hand it around. It won't run out. End of quote. The Dispossessed is the story of how Šebek invents the Ansible that exists as interstellar internet in the 10 books that make up Le Guin's Heinisch cycle. Le Guin already introduced the Ansible in her 1966 novel Rocannon's World, which was her very first novel. There the Ansible is introduced as, I quote, the big machine which can speak instantly to other worlds with no loss of years. End of quote. In her novel The Left Hand of Darkness, published in 1969, Le Guin describes the Ansible communicator as working on the constant of simultaneity that does not require radio waves and produces, I quote, a message at any 2 points simultaneously. A naval ship takes 67 years to go between Gethen and Hain, but if I write a message on the keyboard of the Ansible, it will be received on Hain at the same moment as I write it. End of quote. The Dispossessed reveals the origin of the Ansible in Šebek's development of the general temporal theory. In the essay Utopia and Science Fiction, Raymond Williams argues that in science fiction, utopian transformation are all too often not, I quote, social and moral, but natural. End of quote. He argues that Le Guin's The Dispossessed deprives, I quote, utopia of its classical end of struggle by an open utopia where, quote, the good land is in the grip of the Eurasti dominance. End of quote. I would say that Šebek is the social character really typifying the struggle for an open socialist utopia. Comparable to Jürgen Habermas, Šebek believes in the good potentials of communication and communicative action. Šebek says that speech is sharing, a cooperative art. He sees communication as a means to unbuild walls. That's again a quote. For Šebek, communication is an important foundation of universal peace, of peace in the universe. Šebek describes the potentials of the Ansible as, I quote, making a league of worlds possible, a federation. End of quotes. Šebek imagines the creation of an interstellar public sphere that fosters peace and understanding. And certainly for him, peace and understanding, an interstellar, interplanetary public sphere of the universe has to be connected to a socialist society. And also, if one reads Jürgen Habermas' Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, which was a very early work that he wrote, first published in 1962, it also becomes clear that at that time Habermas also saw the public sphere as being bound up with the creation of a socialist society, which is why Habermas speaks of the limits of the public sphere, that in capitalist society there is the ideal of the public sphere that, however, gets undermined by bureaucracy on the one hand and by capitalist class structures on the other hand, that undermine the universality of the public sphere that bourgeois society promises. So the public sphere for Habermas is a concept for the critique of capitalism. Back to the Dispossessed. The example of the Internet commons shows that in the world that has not gotten rid of class division, dominant classes can turn the commons into commons of capital and commons of authoritarianism. Created as a commons, the World Wide Web is today no longer a commons, but has been colonized by capitalism and authoritarianism. It's dominated by the likes of Google, that is now called Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, and Alibaba. In 2019, these four companies, Alibaba, Facebook, Amazon, and Alphabet, together made profits of over $70 billion from the commodification of the Internet. There is also the political colonization of the Internet by authoritarian demagogues. Look, for example, at how Donald Trump is using Twitter in order to communicate that one should build physical, social, and political walls. An example is a tweet by Trump posted on the 23rd of January 2019. Where he makes the following ideological claim. Build a wall and crime will fall. This is the new theme for 2 years until the wall is finished, and it's under construction now, of the Republican Party. Use it and pray. In general, I think what the Dispossessed shows, what discussions about communication and the public sphere show, is that communication is neither good or evil by nature. It is a tool mediating good and evil social relations. And Habermas points out that there are economic and political forms of the colonization and feudalization of the public sphere, what he calls the refeudalization of the public sphere in his book Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, and the colonization of the life world in his two-volume book Theory of Communicative Action, published in 1984. Applying that insights to the Internet means that commodification and authoritarianism have colonized the Internet. We can learn from Le Guin's works that universal and global communication systems need to rid themselves of commodification and authoritarianism. They need to be designed and used in a participatory democratic manner in order to foster the public sphere, peace, and global understanding. A socialist society needs a socialist system of communication, and vice versa. A socialist system of communication needs a socialist society that is based on the principles of common access, common use, and the creation of possibilities for common encounters of humans that strengthen solidary social relations and friendships. I want to draw some conclusions about Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. The Dispossessed does not convince as a utopian story of how a socialist society could look like. Anaris is really a failed experiment where power inequalities cannot be overcome and where humans suffer and where they are unhappy under the conditions of a socialism of scarcity. The book's strength, however, is the portrayal of Šebek as a socialist social character, a socialist who is both opposed to capitalism on euros and the unhappy life on Anaris that is not really a socialist society. Shevek is a tech socialist who makes his invention, an interstellar internet of the universe called the Ensible, available as a common good, and he sees the socialist potentials of technologies and of computing for the creation of a truly humanist and socialist world. Social transformation requires not just one Shevek, it requires 2, 3, 4 and many Sheveks. In the age of authoritarian capitalism, it is important that we dream about, imagine, talk about, envision, communicate, discuss, and struggle for concrete socialist utopias. In the 21st century, such socialist consciousness needs to pose the question of the digital in order to envision and realize concrete utopias. The proponents today of neoliberal ideology and of authoritarian capitalist ideology want to make us believe that there are no alternatives to capitalism and to digital capitalism. It is precisely in this situation that it is of crucial importance, as Frederick Jameson reminds us in his book Archaeologies of the Future, that concrete utopian socialist thought recovers, I quote Jameson, its vitality as a political slogan and a politically energizing perspective that advances the dialectic of identity and difference and inspires a politics that aims at imagining and sometimes even at realizing a system radically different from this one. So what utopian socialist literature can help us imagining is how a system that is different from digital capitalism could look like. It helps us to envision real utopias of digital socialism. This brings this podcast episode to an end. If you enjoyed this episode, then please subscribe to the Communication, Capitalism and Critique pod on Podbean and follow the next episode. I'm not yet 100% sure what the next episode will focus on, but most likely its topic will be digital socialism in the context of William Morris' novel News from Nowhere. Goodbye.